All right, welcome to the Daniel deep dive video on some common objections to this framework and some of the interpretation of these passages. The content here comes straight from the document, so if you want to read it a little bit more in detail, I'm going to just talk through some bullet point answers to each objection, and a couple of these I would say are more legitimate than others. They're questions I have myself about the framework, but most of them are easily addressed, and so I welcome anybody to drop me a line, put a comment here, drop me a note through the website, and of any objections you have or critiques or challenges. I would love to have much stronger challenges than some of the ones that I'm going to go through here. So if you have them, they come to mind, or you think of them, please send them, and I'll happily do additional videos unpacking any challenges that are presented. So with that, let us dive in. So first one is, you cherry pick the crucifixion date. Well, the answer to that is not really. There's a scholarly consensus. It's 33 AD, April the 3rd. There's astronomical things that align. There's Passover. So very well established long before this framework came around. So we inherited that. We didn't choose that date. It wasn't at all necessary for any of the calculations. Your crescent dates could be off. Yes, that's true, by plus or minus 1 day. So not really a substantial source of error in the first place. And besides, all the alignments survive that wobble. So it's not really a huge dependency, because some of the dates where there is that uncertainty land in a window of judgment days on the feast calendar. So there's sort of a several day window, not in every case, but in some cases. So we don't feel like this is a significant source of concern for the overall framework. And there's of course multiple dates that are aligned here. It's not just one. So for all of them to align is pretty compelling, even given that plus or minus 1 day in certain cases, or in every case really, where we have to convert and we have to know what the first day of that Jewish month was. All right, 7 decades seems arbitrary. Okay, there's a number of other videos you can go watch, so you really shouldn't have this objection if you've actually watched the core videos, the 3 primary 70th7 videos, or read the document. But short answer then is go look at those. But in addition to that, it's an exhaustive comparison of all valid candidates, that is, all linguistically valid candidates, meaning something reasonable that humans know as a period of measurement for tracking time. So day, week, year, decade fits. It could be generation. It could be jubilee years, right? So we've looked at all those. 9 options tested. The math is computed on all of them. Only one works. There's a dedicated video to exploring that in depth, so I would encourage you to go watch that video. And we cover all the details of all of the different options and all of the dates that were under consideration, sort of the date database, if you will, that we look for matches based on the computed days from the numbers. So it's not that it's assumed. It is assumed in the sense that we do read it, but there's justifications from the text. We go over that in the other documents and videos as well. So it's not totally arbitrary and random, but you can even say, sure, that's an assumption, but then we go prove it. You can assume something else and go crunch the numbers. We did that in the exhaustive testing. So it's not arbitrary. There are reasons to believe that from the text that point you in that direction, primarily that the crucifixion has to be the center, some judgment stuff has to be at the end, and that period represents a 3.5. So it's half of the total 70th7. Midpoint crucifixion, endpoint something bad and judgmenty, and that represents a 3.5. So that already suggests, because we know about 70 AD historically, by no means arbitrary to start with 70 years as your first option, and then compute the numbers and see if it works. 7 coincidences can still equal chance. Okay, that's true, but very mathematically impossible. I should have put the numbers on here. It's 1 in 1.18 billion for all of them to align. Of course, our model didn't compute the 69 sevens as 2 dates, or the crucifixion date. So you could say out of the 7, only 4 are computed. Those 4 aligning appropriately, the chances of all 4 of those happening is 1 in 228,000. So is it chance? You decide. At some point, saying that that is still a coincidence. How many dates would have to pile up before you'd say it's not a coincidence and you actually are the one with a faith commitment to some other interpretation? Which I will be surprised, but I guess maybe shouldn't be. Maybe some people will hold that kind of line of commitment. I don't know why, because it's not like this doctrine or the resulting theological implications of this are particularly troubling. They're beautiful. They're awesome. They're very theologically and biblically sound. And so I don't see any reason why there would be a commitment to sort of reject this or say, oh, that's coincidence. Again, going to be very tough to say that it's coincidence based on the math and the numbers. And so any model that doesn't accept this definition of the 77 now has a pretty monumental task of explaining how a wrong interpretation lands at 1 in 1 billion chance of all of those dates aligning the way they do. This one's interesting. This is one of the ones I was alluding to that I myself have questioned and don't know, and some people have asked. Why does Tisha B'Av land on 68 AD and not 70 AD when the temple was actually burned? So in 70 AD, it did actually burn. So that certainly would make sense. I don't have a great answer for that. A couple of things that are of interest. Yeah, so by 68, some things were already unraveling. So desolation is made void. It doesn't necessarily mean demolished, so it doesn't have to land on that. In the Revelation document and videos, we unpack a possible explanation. I'm not committed to that. I'm not saying it's not a hill I'm going to die on, but there's a possible explanation is that it represents a bit of a, hey, this is where you need to be gone. There's the interregnum period that is of interest. It's when Revelation was written, we think, and because of direct textual evidence in Revelation. And so if that's the case, there also was a very short or small window in there. I think it was about a 5-month period. That was the time from between when Rome first came to Jerusalem and was going to try to destroy it. But then there was a lot of turmoil and chaos in the empire, civil war. And so I think it was Vespasian who had been there, sort of had to go back to Rome. He made a play for the emperorship and he got it. And so then he, I think, sent his son maybe back, or he came back for a little while, or he sent his son. But anyway, there was this lull and they stopped attacking Jerusalem for some period of time. And so that would have been your last window to sort of get out of Dodge. And so that's around where those dates happened. The desolation date and the flood date happened around there. So hopefully some of my preterist brothers and sisters who have done tons of research in that arena will maybe dig deeper into that and see, like, is that something they could have calculated? Could they have known those dates? There certainly is the prophecy that is talked about that we cover and others do as well that encouraged them to leave Jerusalem. I think we don't know historically when that happened exactly, but there's sort of a 5-month period where that would have been the time to do that before you would have later been sort of stuck in Jerusalem as the siege came through and they're sort of ransacking villages and everything along the way. It would have been too late to leave. So you couldn't wait till 70 AD to leave Jerusalem to be spared from that destruction, which is certainly, if you haven't watched the Revelation videos or read that document, go there. That is the big piece of Revelation, is to, the book of Revelation, is to cover or to, it's about the coming of that judgment, but also the sparing of the remnant believers during that period of time, the second half of the 77, being spared from that judgment because they're now in Christ. They put their faith in Christ, so they're not under the old covenant, and therefore God's not going to pour that judgment out on them. And so I think maybe these dates landing early is a little bit related to that, of saying, hey, the temple will be destroyed. You need to leave town. You need to be gone. Certainly want to be gone by the time the flood date happens, which is the beginning of the flood in Genesis. That's the date that's referenced in the 77, that final date, the 1335. But when the flood waters open up and the rain starts coming, you don't want to be in town. You need to already be in the boat. All right, Jesus as the abomination that causes desolation. First off, should be obvious, but worth stating that it's not Jesus that's abominable. It's the killing of the Anointed One is the most abominable act in history, certainly in covenantal history, the worst thing for Old Covenant Israel to have done. Jesus gave a parable directly about it, said that once that happened, the king would send his armies to destroy those wicked men who had killed all of the servants and finally killed the son that was sent to them. So it caused the desolation, cause and effect. We've got a whole document dedicated to this, so I don't want to dive into it now. So go see our appendix in the document and a video dedicated to this. So go check that out. Verse 26, this is chapter 9. The prince is different. It's the so-called great he debate, where there's three different he's, some pronouns, and people talk about which one they go with. So this is the argument that it's different people is an argument from one missing word, which is the anointed one, but the same word, the title, the ruler, is there. The same verb about coming is there. So it's very difficult to read that verse not as the preceding, all of the he's are the same. And that's the point we make in the document and in other videos. So it's strong from the text, as well as the overall interpretation makes sense when all of the he's are the same. The reason people don't like that is because there's some destruction words there, that his people will come and destroy the sanctuary and the temple. But again, the parable I just mentioned in the previous question's answer, is Jesus made that clear, that it was the armies, the king's own armies are going to come and bring the destruction. Angelic judgment is real and biblical. It's in the Old Testament. It's also in Revelation. And so that phrase doesn't need to scare us off from taking the simple and textually sound interpretive move of saying that verse is still talking about the same he, the same ruler. It's all the same he in those verses there in the latter part of chapter 9. Okay, the two-agent reading, the frameworks needed. The reason that is split off and we say that's the the Antichrist, is because frameworks that have that Antichrist in the future, they got to stick it somewhere, and that's one place. To do it, that's one reason. The other, as I mentioned, is we sort of trip over, to bring destruction to the sanctuary and the temple. Well, that can't be Jesus, the Messiah, the good guy. That's got to be the bad guy. But we need to think about that longer and realize, actually, no, the good guy does bring judgment too. He said he would, and it's Old Testament biblical, and there's examples of it, so it's very well supported. It's not a crazy concept at all, but it's fair that we, at first read, we think, destruction, destroy the sanctuary and the temple, that must be the bad guy. So it must not be the same he, but it is. Covenant with many for 1/7. This is another one I agree is a weak point. The whole framework doesn't rise and fall on this, so I'm not worried about it in that sense, but it is something that I've pondered. Would love someone to do a deep dive and sort of figure out prayerfully and with study. It says he'll confirm a covenant with many for 1/7, but if we think about, and the many is fine, I don't have a problem with that. There is a period of covenantal overlap, so you could look at the 70th 7 in a few ways. The first half, the old covenant was in place for sure up until the cross, but Jesus was here, and he said he was here to bring a new thing, right? New command I give you, love one another. So there were certain new things he was already introducing during his life and ministry that were necessarily only coming after the cross. So quasi new covenant happening alongside the old in the first half of the 70th 7. In the second half, also a little bit fuzzy, because the old covenant we could say is ended at the cross, and I would agree with that. But the 70th 7 and Revelation also tell us that the 70th 7 second half includes the old covenant. It's unwinding during that period. It's on its way out. It's fading. Hebrews says as much. It's fading. It will soon be obsolete, or what is obsolete is now fading and will eventually totally be gone. So in some ways it's still there. The other way you can think about it is because the judgment that was coming between the crucifixion and the end of the 70th 7 was because of that covenant being in place. It had been violated, but it was still very much in place. And the consequences of that covenantal arrangement that were baked in and decreed inside it, if you do this, this is what will happen, had to be poured out. So in a sense, you can say the old covenant was over at the cross, but it wasn't really from another perspective, because it was the desolations and the judgment needed to unfold before it was finally over and ended. And so during the second half of the 70th 7, you have the new covenant inaugurated at the cross, but you have the unwinding of the old. So the covenant with many for 1/7 here from Daniel, who's the many? And for 1/7, because if you look at the new covenant as being from the cross forward, it's not for the whole 7, it would be half of the 7. And so that's the confusion there, is a little bit like, what exactly does that mean? Does it mean the whole 7 from incarnation to the end? And if so, which covenants are involved? There's kind of this overlap, so it's a little bit confusing there. I certainly will agree with that. Jesus did seem to inaugurate the new covenant at the Last Supper as the crucifixion day was in play, and said, "This is the cup of this cup is the cup of the new covenant in my blood." So Again, the covenant was inaugurated, so it's kind of confusing before and after the crucifixion, which covenants were exactly in place. Who's he making the covenant with? The many, but I think it's clear enough that it's the new covenant that's mostly under consideration in Daniel. And so that's the thing that is primarily being discussed. But again, strictly speaking, you might naturally think, well, he made a covenant with those, if that's the many, he made a covenant with them for half a seven, the second half of the 70th seven, not for 1/7. Okay, Daniel 2, verse 2 is physical resurrection. This is an interesting one. Also a bit of a challenge. I did a deep dive on this because of that realization. So I feel comfortable with this, but understand that people can get tripped up on it. It says multitudes who sleep in the dust will awake. It talks about some to judgment, some to life, and some to death. But that word is not actually all. It does mean many. Multitudes is a good translation. Other English translations will use the word many. Go read Ezekiel 37. Rising from the dust is linked to spiritual awakening. So I'll say that the primary answer here is that this is the new birth. I understand there's some of the language seems to be maybe more than that, or the argument is usually that the word that's used for resurrection is the word for physical resurrection. Having not delved too deep into the Hebrew, can't speak a whole lot to that except to say, again, the context, that one little verse, this is the only troubling verse, by the way. The verse before and after and the rest of it, all very much comfortable New Covenant language. And again, the context of the 70th seven, we know, so that locks in this interpretation, I would say, as well. This was more debatable prior to the 70th seven, but now that we know what that is and we can see those dates, then it's much harder to take this verse 2 and put it into the distant future. One of the reasons is because it doesn't say all will awake, it says some or many. Revelation has a great white throne judgment where all the dead are raised, and it's very specific and comprehensive. It says the sea will give up their dead, the land will give up the dead, Sheol gives up, it said everybody coughs up their dead people, and it's an everybody resurrection, and an everybody gets judged, final consummation in the very end of Revelation. So the verbiage here, although some of it is profound in terms of the like cosmic, big spiritual things, or I shouldn't say spiritual, the claim is that it's an earthly or it's a physical resurrection. The language is greater than that, but that fits the 70th seven, talking about great cosmic things, that the inauguration of the new covenant is itself a big deal, a really big deal. And so I think here again we make the mistake of going, oh, this big stuff must be future. No, the big stuff is Christ crucified. And it results in this, a great spiritual awakening that Ezekiel also saw, that from the dust they will awake. John chapter 5, Jesus also said the dead will hear his voice and will live. So the idea that spiritually dead people will hear his voice and will be brought to life is, again, the new birth. It's here in Ezekiel, it's in Daniel, it's in John, and definitely a New Testament well-established concept. Verse 3 there, again, it's the apostolic community active in the 70th seven. Again, the 70th seven comes to our aid in helping us narrow down the time window and lock it in place. And we know that we're post the transition verse. So you go watch the other video about the patterns in Daniel, how all the 5 visions follow the same pattern. Here we are well past the transition point. And so we know that we're not in the roadmap lead up, we're in the 70th seven. And so very appropriate to talk about spiritual awakening and new birth and resurrection. Again, these are phrases used directly in the New Testament. It's not hyperbole or exaggeration to call those things a resurrection. So chapter 12, verse 2, a little bit troubling, but its context surrounding verses, as well as the context being within the 70th seven, is the answer to this. And it's not a physical resurrection, it's the new covenant. New birth, so being born again. And that's it.